Welcome, fellow beekeepers. This is Jamie Walters, OSBA Maumee Valley Director and Newsletter Editor. I'm pleased to announce OSBA's new live webinar training series. Live sessions will be recorded on the second and fourth Sunday of each month at 7 p.m. through Zoom conference call. You're welcome to attend by reserving a spot on OSBA's Facebook page or by sending an email to editor@ohiostatebeekeepers.org. Each training session will be recorded and posted on the following Sunday on Ohio State Beekeepers' new YouTube channel. You can find it at Ohio State Beekeepers Association. You're welcome to subscribe and be sure to click the bell to be alerted each time we upload a new video. Each month's speaker and presentation will be posted on our Facebook page, by direct emails that'll go out to registered and paid members, and our website at ohiostatebeekeepers.org. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at editor@ohiostatebeekeepers.org. And now, on to our previously recorded session.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am thrilled to see everybody there. And again, a huge thanks needs to go out to Ohio State Beekeepers Association and Jamie Walters for putting this together, because beekeeping education is incredibly important. Ohio State beekeepers know that. I know that. Everybody here that's here tonight knows that. So we're very lucky that we have this at our disposal. Let me see if I'm able to start the slideshow yet.
Yep, you have control, Dave.
Okay. For some reason, when I'm clicking on it, it's not. There we go. Okay. There we go. So we're going to be talking about spring splits, increasing your hives effectively. I also like to call this just swarm management, because as we'll see, a lot of times splits is all about swarm management. This is the time of year. We were just having a conversation for some of the people that logged in a little bit early. Swarms are happening. I've gone out on a swarm call, and we've been seeing our hives swarming. We had a cold spell here in central Ohio, and right after that cold spell, that cold snap, that day, the minute it warmed up, they were swarming, because they've been preparing to swarm since back in February. I don't think I've seen so many hives so big this early in the year. So very timely. Maybe even just a little bit behind, because I know some people have already seen some swarms and seen their hives swarming already. I'm going to take my time and talk slowly today, and I will be stopping every couple of slides, and I'm just trying to make sure there's a little bit of delay on the clicks, and I don't want to over click. We're going to do 4 parts today. Let me see. Are we still on the first slide there?
Yes, Dave.
Okay. I am having a little trouble getting it to advance. There we go. Now I'm not. Just patience. That's all it takes. So tonight, what we're going to talk about, spring splits. The first part of spring splits is I love to start all of my talks and presentations with what is this that we're doing according to the bees. So part 1 will be a quick review. What are splits? What does that mean to bees and honeybee colonies? Okay. Part 2, we're going to talk about from the beekeeper's point of view. Why do we do splits? Why split? What is the point of doing that? Why we split can affect how we split. I'm going to hit one more time. Oops. There we go. We're also going to talk about who to split. So that's the queen selection part of this, or the colony and queen selection part of this equation. And finally, we're going to get to the whole meat of it, the whole reason that you're here. We're going to get to how to split. And please, everybody, bear with me as this is my first time doing a Zoom meeting, and I'm trying to balance patience with maybe my inability to work the computer a little bit. So the how to split part is really kind of going to be the meat of it. But like I say, I like to start this with what they are from the bee's point of view, what they are from the beekeeper's point of view, and get a little bit of background before we just jump into splitting. I've learned through my years of beekeeping that when I don't sit down and plan out stuff, that's when I make my worst management mistakes. So let's start with what are splits. Okay. There we go. And according to a honeybee colony in the spring, that's the time of year that the honeybee colonies start building up. Those first flushes of nectar and pollen. So in our slide here, we've got our queen, and the brown circle is the sphere of brood. The red circle represents the pollen. Yellow is the honey. And that gray circle there is the adult bees. And we'll talk more about that. But during the spring, and I think the animations on this are just going to be a little bit slow, these hives are constantly building up. And this is all part of their natural process of swarming. Okay. They start to produce new queens. In the colonies, we can see as many as 10 to 20 new queen cells when a hive is getting ready to swarm. I've seen honeybee frames with 24 to 30 cells just on one frame. Okay, so they produce a lot of queen cells in preparation for swarming. And then, as we know, the old queen leaves with probably, some new research is saying, as many as 2/3 of the adult bees from the hive, okay, which seems like an enormous amount. But remember, they're leaving all that brood behind. So that massive population hit gets taken care of fairly quickly. Okay. Then it comes down to just one queen cell or one queen that's going to be left in the new hive. And that's our virgin queen. Our swarm is taken away by a friendly beekeeper in the local area who's on the swarm list. And then the only thing left to do is for that virgin queen to take her mating flights and get mated. I'm going to make sure I'm up to date here. So that's what splits are from a beekeeper's point of view, or from a bee colony's point of view. A split is just reproduction. It's swarming. It's a natural way for bee colonies to reproduce and increase their numbers. So why do we split as beekeepers? What are the main reasons? This isn't going to be new information to the vast majority of you. But again, I like to have this as background. The main reason for splitting is we want to increase or replace colonies. Either we're enjoying beekeeping so much that we want to just get some more beehives and really get a little more elbow deep into it, or we've lost a few colonies and we want to get back up to where we were the previous year. Also, swarm management. I know in the last week, since that cold snap, all of my splitting has been driven by swarm management and preventing, or I should say managing, the hives that are looking like they want to swarm. You don't prevent them from swarming, because splitting basically is a mirror image of the swarming process. There we go. And the third reason that we do splits is in order to make money to sell nucleus colonies. So those are sort of the three main reasons that we do splits. And I think it's very important for us to understand that it can affect how we split, but really it doesn't change very much in degree of how we split. Or, I mean, it varies more in degree of splitting, not in the actual kind of splitting that we do. And we'll talk more about that when I talk about the recipe for splits. And now we want to get on to, who do we split? when I think about splitting and I'm coming out to the colonies and I want to look at who's going to become my mating nooks, who's going to become my nooks to sell, who's going to become my replacement hives or my increase hives, I look at two parts to a split. Okay. First, there, it's actually giving me, Jamie, I'll let you know, it's giving me a good signal when I press the button and it doesn't let me forward it. It's giving me a audio notification of that. So that's helpful.
Thank you.
There we go. The two parts to a split I like to think of as the foundation of the split and the future of the split. So what's the foundation of the split? The foundation of the split is the population. And by population, I always mean adult bees, the brood, and brood is anything that's not an adult bee. It's eggs, larvae, and pupa. And the stores. And by stores, I mean pollen, honey, and also feed. This time of year, sometimes with splits, we do need to feed, especially if we get a little bit of cold weather after our splits. Okay. The future of a split is the genetics. Okay. So the genetics is going to be referring to, of course, the queen, and that's going to be that's going to directly impact the performance, how successful your split is at becoming a full-grown colony and then going into production mode, whatever it is that you're interested in producing. So the two parts of a split, we have the mother colony and the queen. Those are the two things we really need to be concerned about. So when we go to selecting who we're going to be making our splits from, we want to look at, I always like to say, the big fat colonies. You know, I like to think of a honeybee colony as sort of like a bear. And what does a bear do in preparation for winter? You know, it puts on a lot of fat stores and a lot of eating. Honeybee colonies do that as well. But right before mating season in the spring, they also really beef up, put on a lot of weight. Let's see how many of these come up all at once. So the qualities that we're looking for in a colony that's split, and the first one, you're going to be like, duh, Dave, if I can ever get it to come up. Obviously, you want a colony that survived winter. Okay? And that may seem like a no-brainer. But in part, for myself, that also means it survived at least one winter, probably two. I like colonies that have survived 2 winters. But the other reason I put that on there is often the fall, late fall and winter is a great time for beekeepers to sit down and plan out their next year. And I can't tell you how many times I've decided, you know, during my planning, there are certain queens that I want to graft from and raise daughter queens. There's certain colonies that I think are going to become my cell builders, or they're going to be really beefy and good based on their performance, that I'll be able to turn them into a bunch of nooks. And they end up not surviving winter, or surviving winter so poorly that I no longer want to consider them for that. So that's just sort of a warning of don't get caught in your own plans as you're in the winter time, especially. Spring is the time that you really are going to be adjusting a lot of your plans. You also want a colony that has fast spring buildup. One of the things a honeybee colony needs to do, especially up in these northern latitudes, is to come out of winter and build up to be ready to take advantage, full advantage of the nectar flow that's happening, you know, starting right now, but especially the middle of May, it really hits hard. And if they're not building up, you know, starting in April, they're not going to be able to take advantage of that nectar flow in May. Okay. In other words, we want to see, like I said, a big fat hive, lots of PBS, as I call it, population, brood, and stores. In other words, we want to split our swarmy colonies. It comes back to that basics, that splitting is just the beekeeper mirroring what bees naturally do during the swarming process. Okay. So what about queens? I'm going to talk a little bit about queens here. The first thing is, what kind of queens do we want when we're splitting? When we're deciding the future, when we talk about the foundation, that's who we're splitting from. And the future is what the genetics we're going to get to head up that. There we go. Head up that split. So the queens that we're going to choose to put in our split, the three general things that I want to do is they have to be proven. I want a genetic line that has time and time and time again proven that it can come in and produce. It can survive winter. It can have some kind of resistance and tolerance to all kinds of diseases and pests, including varroa mite. We want it to be productive. And I use the word productive to mean not just how much honey it produces, because a lot of my colonies, I run to make more colonies. So their productiveness is really producing brood and bees. If any of you went to the Tri-County meeting, you'll remember Michael Palmer talking about these brood factories. Okay. So brood equals adult bees equal honey. So production, if I've got a queen that produces a ton of brood, but I'm managing her because I'm constantly splitting her all year long, I'm managing her not to produce honey. That doesn't mean she's not a productive queen. So I like to use the more general term productive. And it's alliterative as well, because we also, for me, one of the most important things is to have pleasant bees. And what I mean by that is they need to be workable. Especially if this is a hobby for you or a sideline. Often it can take more time to suit up and get out of the suit than you're going to be out working the bees. Also, if you're in an urban setting or have neighbors anywhere nearby, you want to have nice, gentle, workable bees. If you're constantly fighting your bees, everything about your bees that you have to do becomes harder. Whether it's doing mite checks, whether it's treating for mites, making splits, finding the queen. The nasty hives, it's so much harder to find the queens and do any of the work because you spend so much time fighting them. So those are my three things that I'm looking for in a queen when I'm deciding who's going to be the future of this split. Okay, I want her to be from a proven genetic line, from a productive genetic line, and from a pleasant, workable genetic line. Okay, so there's another thing I want to talk about queens, because how do you get those queens? Well, there's several ways. I'm going to talk about three of them that we would get queens for our splits. The first is buy a queen. And I put that at number one because I'm a queen producer and therefore I'm very biased. Everybody should be buying queens. But there's other ways. You can use a swarm cell. If you go out into your hives and there's a lot of swarm cells and everything that's going on in that hive tells you, you look at the calendar, it's late April, they're getting packed full of pollen and nectar. There's swarm cells everywhere. Guess what? You need to manage that swarming and make a split before those bees end up in your neighbor's attic. And now, you're in a war with your neighbors because of the dang bees there. The other thing you can do is you can force an emergency queen. This is not my favorite way to do it. And I'm going to go into that just a little bit to just talk about why the risks and advantages. Every single one of these, whether it's buying a queen, using a swarm cell, or forcing an emergency queen to be produced, they all have benefits and they all have disadvantages and risks. So let's look at some of those real quick. And then once we get through this, we'll stop for a couple of questions. I'm just checking the time to make sure. Yes, we should be able to do that. I'm just going to give it a second to catch up if it will. if anybody's heard me present before, you know that this part's not going to come as a surprise to you. But the myth and math of so-called free queens, and I just want to talk about this for a bit. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. I just want to go really quickly from here. One queen is the equivalent of 4,000 to 8,000 workers. So by that, I mean, in the natural swarming process, if you remember, we said that a colony can produce somewhere between 10 to 20 queen cells. It can produce a lot more sometimes or not. Each queen cell gets fed 400 times more food than a worker does. And all of that food that's fed to those 10 to 20 queen cells could have been fed to 4,000 to 8,000 larvae that would become workers. But we only get one queen out of the natural swarming process. So therefore, that one queen costs 4,000 to 8,000 workers. That's a third of a package, 4,000 to 8,000 bees. That's about $50 for one queen. I'm using $150 as a base price for packages. Okay. Also, when you're doing either forcing an emergency queen or even using a swarm cell, you've got a range somewhere between 15 to 30 days, there's going to be no eggs. And if you do the math on that, with the queen potentially laying 1,000 to 1,500 eggs a day, a good average is about 20,000 workers. It's anywhere from 10,000 to 45,000 workers. Well, 20,000 workers comes out to be about a package. And so that's another $150. And again, remember, those 20,000 workers that aren't being laid by a queen who hasn't finished mating or developing yet, those are 20,000 workers that are not out collecting nectar and producing honey. Okay, so there we have one package. So that, quote, free queen can cost you up to $200. There are advantages. Brood breaks, as we know, are more and more important in honeybee management, especially with regards to varroa mites. So again, I'm not saying that one way is better than the other, but when you're deciding what's going to be the future of your colony, what genetics you're going to get to do it, and you can buy, use a swarm cell, or force an emergency queen, you should be informed of what the risks are and what the opportunity costs could be. Okay. There is one other thing I do want to mention, only because I think it's clever. And that is when you, especially when you force an emergency queen or queen cell, you risk the heartbreak of AES. Sorry for everyone who's heard this before. Spoiler alert. And what that means is when I'm grafting queens, I can graft 100 larvae, and by the time I get them in for their mating flights and they come back and they're mated and laying eggs, I expect about 30% attrition. The meaning some of those queens do not make it back from their mating flights, and that is the result of what I call, boy, I don't want to click again in case it doesn't, if it goes too fast. That's the Amelia Earhart syndrome, when your queen doesn't come back. Okay. Again, this is not to say that you can't do these things. There's a lot going on with raising queens. Like I say, brood breaks are a good thing. If your hive's about to swarm and you've got swarm cells, you need to make that split right then and there, right? You don't want them going away, living in some tree in the woods or some neighbor's house. There we go. And I'm all for brood breaks. In fact, this past weekend I just caged up 2 or 3 queens that I did some splits on, but they were still looking pretty swarmy. So I caged them up. I'm marking them caged for 5 days, and just to give a little bit of a brood break. Again, it helps, and I want to say helps in quote, with varroa management. It is not a cure. It's not a treatment. It's just one little extra thing that deprives varroa mite of some breeding space. Okay. So right there, that's the background I wanted to cover. That was what is a split? Why are we splitting as beekeepers? Our next topic is how to split. And so I want to talk and stop here and see if there's any outstanding questions that we want to address at this point.
Yes, Dave, we have a few.
Okay, great.
Okay. First question is from Larry.
Yes.
Fast buildup. Is that with or without the beekeeper feeding and pollen patties?
That's a great question. Here's my right off the cuff answer. I say either, because again, if you go back to it being swarm management, if you're feeding them and that's causing them to build up to a threshold where they're going to swarm, then we have to manage that somehow and not let them go. So that's fine too. You may want to consider that if you've been feeding them, you're not getting a true sense of their buildup. So maybe that you don't want to use a swarm cell from her or force an emergency queen.
Okay, the next question is, can you define what a swarm cell is? This is from Justin.
Yes, so a swarm cell is, I'm going to use some generally speaking, in the spring, when bee colonies are beginning to think about reproducing, they start raising new queens. The best way to think of a swarm cell is colonies build queen cups, which are cells that face downwards, especially in the spring, but kind of all year round. When a queen runs out of room to lay eggs, all she has left are those queen cups. So she'll start laying eggs in those. And the workers simply start feeding those a queen's diet. The eggs then hatch and become larvae, and those larvae become queens because they are in those queen cups that have become swarm cells. And then those swarm cells help to initiate and trigger the swarming behavior.
Okay. This is from Larry. What do you think of Randy Oliver's Queen for Pennies model?
That is a good question. I don't have an opinion on that because I'm going to have to read that. I don't think that's one I've read.
I'm going to add in just 2 cents on that. I can answer this later because this is about Dave's show. I do, and I have done that on Science Beekeeping on Randy Oliver's site. It is actually taking the hive, doing the same thing, but you're crafting on a smaller scale, and you're just putting the cups inside. So you're doing it at each little cup you're putting in. It's a small. You're not building a cell starter. You're just doing it on a smaller scale, doing 3 and 4 and 5 queens at a time. That's it.
Gotcha. Oh, I'm all for that. So I've been the last 3 years I've been playing with the idea of I actually do cell builders in little 5-frame nooks, but I'm only grafting somewhere between 5 and 10 cells. So I'm all over that. Randy Oliver, I will say, just generally, can't go too wrong with him.
This is, does putting a new queen or older bees cause her to be rejected? So I'm thinking that from the question, if they're putting in a new queen, could you get rejected by the older bees?
Yeah. So my understanding on this is that it's the young nurse bees that are really in charge of raising queens, feeding queens, accepting or rejecting queens. Older bees that are foragers, they don't care. I always think of those movies, those old cop movies. Foragers, they got 2 days till retirement, and they don't care what's going on at the top, right? So it is the younger bees, actually, that no matter what are going to accept or reject. So if you have a colony that doesn't have any young nurse bees, then there's I would say a higher chance of rejection. I'm actually going to address that in the how to split, because making sure that you have young bees in your split and bees of all ages is important if we can.
Okay. And from Linda, what is a brood break and caging mean?
Okay, a brood break is when the queen is either stopped from or just naturally stops laying eggs for a period of time. And that can happen over the winter naturally. They stop her from laying eggs. They stop feeding her, they meaning the workers. And that puts a break in the brood cycle. Within a colony, every single day there are eggs being laid, and every single day there are brand new bees emerging as adults for the first time, and every age in between. When you do a brood break, that there's a stop, 5, 10, 15 days. That happens, a brood break always happens, I shouldn't say always, with bees, nothing is always. A brood break usually happens, it's a part of swarming, just due to the mechanics of it. Caging, I just grab the queen and I put her in a small cage that's got screens on it, and I leave that in the colony so that the worker bees know she's there, and they can pass pheromone back and forth, and they can feed her and keep her going, but it prevents her from laying eggs. And that's something I don't recommend if you've never had experience doing that, but I like to do it to help. It gives me a couple days to deal with swarming if it's really bad, and like I say, it could be a little bit of a ROA management technique, one very small part.
Okay. Eric has a question, and we're going to save this to the end. He's a new beekeeper. What other signs can I see other than a swarm cell? So we're going to save that one for the end because that's a little bit longer. From Alicia, okay. How do I manage swarms if I do not want new colonies, but I like the genetics of my queen? Very good question.
Very good question. A lot of times then you can get into caging is one way. That won't be a full stop. Adding extra space will work to a point. I mean, eventually a bee colony is going to swarm, in that all living creatures have this drive to reproduce, and swarming is all about reproduction. So that's why I always say manage swarming instead of controlling it or stopping it. If you don't want more bees, it's really hard. I don't know, Jamie, chime in if you've got other ideas, but my thought is make the splits and then sell them. Keep the queen you like, and sell them and make some money. Get some, you've spent a lot of money on hives and bees and beekeeping equipment, and there are people who will pay money for a split off of a hive. So if more beekeepers in Ohio used splitting as a way to do swarm management, it would greatly improve some of the genetic stock and availability of bees.
And on top of that, I'll chime in just for this bit.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to make, for 2 full-size colonies, if you have a nuke around, it is an extra queen that if something happens to that hive or that colony, yes, or it swarms, you have an extra resource there. You can let it build up. You don't have to keep it just in a 5-frame box. Add on another box on the top and let it get a 5/5/5, and use it just for resources. Steal brood from it. You can take it down, and if you want to, sell it for that $160, $170, $180 to somebody else local in the club, and just use it as a resource, or make money back in your pocket, because we all know beekeeping is cheap, correct?
Right. No, Jamie, thank you for mentioning that, because that is one of the other things I love to mention all the time. More and more beekeepers, I think, should do what I call the 2.5 hives model. I think Larry Connor wrote a lot about that. If you've got that little split that's a 5-frame nook, and like you say, you can let it grow to be a three boxes, 3 5-frames tall. When you lose a queen for whatever reason, she swarms late in the season or she gets smushed, you don't have to call me and order a queen. You've got one sitting right there in your nook, and it's ready to go, and it's easy to put them back. So there's a lot of things. I mean, honestly, I don't want to go on too much with that. But I think that alone, like the 2.5 hives, would be a great topic for a seminar. Some of the benefits of that. How do we maintain that we only want 2 hives? How do we sell those nooks? How do we do 2.5?
Okay, and we have one last question. There's a couple in between, so I apologize to everybody, but that's a long explanation. So from Melissa, if you want to have hives for honey production this year, but still want nukes, should I use cap brood when I make the nukes, or young brood?
That's a good question. I'm going to say you need to use some of both. Now, we're going to get into how to split, so a little spoiler alert. I'm going to give you a recipe for splitting, and it's a recipe, not a formula. So brood is going to be part of that recipe. And whether you have more capped brood than you have eggs and open brood, that's up to you and what you want to do. How big of a split you make, as you'll see, is also up to you, because yes, we want to manage swarming. Pardon me. On the one hand, we want to manage swarming, but on the other hand, we still want our original hive to make a honey crop. So there is a balancing act to that, absolutely. And to be honest, a lot of that comes with experience, but hopefully I'll give you some information tonight that can help with that.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get back. We're going to let Dave take back over the controls. So if there's any other questions, please keep adding them in, and then we'll keep going on from here. So Dave, I'm going to turn everything back over to you.
Okay, great. Okay, so great questions, everybody. I mean, honestly, I wish we had time we've already got the great questions, and we haven't even gotten to the meat of the presentation of how do we do splits. So let's get into that. And there we go. So in this section of the talk, I'm going to give you the recipe for how to do a split. And I kind of spoiled that a little bit. And then we're going to go through step by step how to do a split. Okay, my step-by-step could be different from others. You can combine and change them around, but I want to just give you an outline of how to think about doing a split. And I tried to break it down to be as basic as possible so that I'm not confusing it with some of the maybe bad habits and good habits that I've developed over the years. And let's just get into it. Okay, so here's our hive again. I'm just going to point out a few things again. I apologize for the repetition, but here's our hive. It's come out of winter. It's been building up really well through the spring. So there we've got our queen. That brown is our brood. It's both eggs, larvae, and capped brood. We've got a good pollen flow coming in. So there's pollen in there. There's honey or nectar. And we've got our population of bees. So to make a split, what we need is we need population, right? So that's our, right there, that's our adult bees. Every time I talk about population, I'm talking about adult bees. We need brood, and we need all stages, in my opinion, of brood. We want eggs to capped brood. The reason I say that is that when we make our split, we want to provide as little disruption to the life cycle of the colony as possible. Therefore, it can just take off right away. You know, when we get packages, they don't have any brood. And if you were able to get a package or a nook at the same time as you were able to get a package, right, you would see that nook would take off because it's got new bees being produced all the time. It would outpace the package because it has that uninterrupted life cycle going on. Okay, so we want all stages. The amounts of each stage, that can be a personal decision. We also need stores, which means honey, pollen, and or a feeder. You know, we just went through a cold snap, and I know people who made a bunch of splits, and the bees weren't able to get out to forage, and there wasn't a ton of honey to begin with, so we had to put in some extra feed. And the final thing that we need to make a split is a queen, if that comes up, as a queen, right? And again, there's 3 basic ways to get a queen. You can buy one, you can use swarm cells, and you can force an emergency queen. I'm in the habit of ordering queens every spring because I know I often will have to split before I can raise queens of my own. And I like to have a ready to go mated queen on hand to make those splits. Let's see if it'll advance here. Okay, so I'm going to bring up a picture here of a split. Possibly, there we go. So there's our split. Again, I'm going to show you there's a huge variety and different ways of doing a split, but I'm just going to be splitting off one box. It's not quite a nook. It's not quite a half a hive. Just to show you what this would look like when I'm doing the split. So that in here, what we're going to have is something set up like this. From the mother hive, from our foundation, I have taken honey. So I've got 2 frames there. I've got frames that have brood and pollen. And so it's brood and capped brood. And then for this example, I put in a feeder. It could be more frames of honey if that's available. Okay. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what you're seeing. I personally always put my brood in the center because therefore it's got the most insulation. Could you put in 5 frames of brood and 3 frames of honey? Absolutely. Could you put in 6 frames of brood and 2 frames of honey? Absolutely. But you're going to have to watch and make sure that they've got enough food coming in, or that you've got a feeder on them to handle all of that population. The other thing is when you're moving these frames over, you're going to be moving the bees on them. And then we'll also talk about possibly shaking extra bees in. Okay. So that's our recipe. This is sort of the picture of the, what it looks like when we're done. Really basic outline. Lots of variability. Don't use this as a blueprint. Use this as, you want bees and brood in the middle, food on the outside. That's the takeaway from here. If this is a 10 frame box, you want bees and brood in the middle and food on the outside. If it's a 5 frame nook that you're making up, same thing. Bees and brood in the middle and food on the outside. And of course, the 4th ingredient, a queen. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, I can answer questions about that, but that's the basic recipe. That's how it's going to look with a lot of variation. Some people like more garlic, some people like less ginger. So we can, that's how a recipe is used. This isn't baking. We don't have to have the formula exactly right to make sure that the bread rises perfectly. So let's go through this step by step. I'm going to outline the steps for you real quick before we get going. First, know what your management goal is. There's nothing worse than going into the beehives and not knowing why you're there and what you want to accomplish. Okay. So is your management goal only swarm management, or is it, I'm going to make a bunch of nooks because I need a new pair of shoes, right? Then you have to assess the colonies. Even if you've selected them, you need to assess the colony. How many bees does it have? What's its population look like? How much brood, how many frames of brood does it have? And how much honey and pollen does it have in there? Okay. And you're assessing that colony and you're going to decide, can I make a large split, a small split, 3 or 4 splits? Okay. But you have to assess it. Then possibly the most important part is you have to find and isolate the current queen. There's nothing worse than taking all your queen cells, putting them in the split, and you happen to have taken the queen and put her there, and now you've got this giant massive hive with no queen and no queen cells. So you have to find and isolate the queen. I've got a couple of pro tips that will help make that, because I know a lot of people are sitting there going, I don't know how to find a queen. I can't find a queen. Okay. So once we know why we're splitting, and we've seen how much we can split because we know how much population, brood, and stores we have, and we found the queen and isolate her, then we distribute the assets. We split that hive. Okay. Our 5th step is we install the new queen into whichever part of our split that does not have a queen. Okay. So we're likely leaving the old queen in one of the hives. I will say this, I often put my old queen, especially if she's 2 or 3 years old, I'm going to put her in the smallest split that I make, because she will swarm at the drop of a hat. So I want to make sure she has not got the resources to swarm right away after that. And I think I went backwards. There we go. Split, install. And then finally, most importantly, none of this matters if you don't come back and check both colonies. Okay. So here, let's look at this. What are we doing? Know our management goal. We've got a hive that's built up. It's ready to swarm. So what's our management goal? We want to prevent swarming. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this 3-box hive and I'm going to split it into two 2-box hives. Okay. So I have basically split it 50-50. I've given half the brood to one hive, half the brood to another hive. I apologize, that went by real quick. And half the population as well. And then I've also added more space because I went from 3 boxes of bees to 4. So I've added empty comb or foundation to both of those. That empty comb and foundation is going to give the bees some breathing space. It's going to reduce the pressure on them to swarm. Another management goal, another way to do this might be that I just want to get a nook out of this or a small hive. And like there was a question about, we want our hives to be ready to make honey, even though we're doing swarm management. Okay, hopefully this doesn't go too many at once, right? So we can just take this small split out, leaving most of the bees in the population. I'm sorry, I'm pointing at the screen. That's leaving most of the bees in population in that top box. She's going to be ready to produce honey. She's had the pressure of swarming removed from her, so she's not going to miss out on the honey flow and honey production because she's swarmed off into somebody's tree somewhere. So that's another one to do. And then finally, we want to make nooks. Our management goal is to make and sell nooks. And we'll see if that comes up. And we're just going to split this basically a 3-box hive into 3 small boxes. Okay. So you can see it doesn't have to be a 50-50 split. It can be a 2/3, 1/3. You can split it, there we go, into 3 little ones. There's some hives that I'll split into, instead of 3 small hives, I'll split them into 6 or 7 mating nooks. Okay? And that's a whole nother presentation. But the main thing is that you have all the elements or all the ingredients of a colony. You need a brood of all ages, population of adult bees, and a queen, and as well as food, some way for them to get energy and feed themselves. And that's going to give you the start of a hive. That's what a nucleus colony is. It's the nucleus. It's everything that there is in a colony, and it will continue to grow from there. It's a lot like dividing perennial plants in a way. You know, digging up those hostas and splitting them and letting them get a new start. Okay. Now let's look at assessing the colony. So far, this has done pretty good. It hasn't gone way beyond where I'm talking. I've shown a little bit of restraint and patience and clicking, and I'm going to try to finish this up in 7 minutes if I can. Okay, so we're going to assess the colony, and that just means when you go in, and you don't have to do this the same day that you split. I often will go in ahead of time and make notes. Which colonies am I going to split? And I make notes on about how many splits I think I can get out of them. And so I want to know approximately how many frames of brood, how many of these boxes can I get out of this box? Okay. And do I have the queens to do that? So that's all the assess colony means is know what you're getting into, know what you have before you just start splitting. There's nothing worse than pulling out 5 or 6 frames of brood, setting it off with a new queen, and then you go through the rest of the hive and find out, oh, it only had 5 frames of brood and there's nothing else left. So do that ahead of time. Assess your colonies. Keep good notes. Okay. Now, let's see. Assess colonies. Let me make sure, because this one's one I don't want to go too fast on. Perfect. Okay, here we have to find and isolate the queen. So if you're not expert at finding queens, you know, there's ways to learn. I teach classes on that, but we still have to find her. There's a couple of pro tips for finding her. I'm going to share one of those tonight. And I do this all the time. I like to pride myself on my ability to find queens, but I don't always have to look for the queen to isolate her. And when I'm making splits for nooks or mating nooks, I often don't even bother to spend any time looking for her. What I do is I take my 3 boxes of hive, right? So right here we are. There's our brood. And I empty the top box. And by that, I mean, I get a box that has no bees or anything in it. I'm going to get a queen excluder. I'm going to shake all the adult bees down into the bottom boxes. I'm going to put a queen excluder on that. And then I'm going to make my split. So I'm going to pull frames that have bees and brood and honey on them up above the queen excluder, but I'm brushing all the bees off of those frames. So I put empty frames of brood up above the queen excluder, close that up, leave it overnight, and then the next day I come and everything above this queen excluder is a bunch of nurse bees and other bees taking care of this brood. I've got all my brood, my honey, my stores, and no queen because she hasn't gotten through that queen excluder. So I just go by the next day and I'll just take those boxes off and there's my split. Now all I have to do is find a queen to put her in that. Hopefully that makes sense for everyone. Get all of your adult bees down in the 2 boxes, queen excluder, put those frames that you want to make your split, capped brood, open brood, eggs, honey, pollen, put that above the queen excluder with no bees on those frames. I'm telling you, it takes like 15 or 20 minutes for those young nurse bees to go up and start taking care of that brood. Leave it overnight and you've got yourself a really nice split. Okay. So again, we're going to sort of repeat a little bit of the things we've done. You're going to distribute the assets. How you do it, it depends on, again, like I said, are we doing the just taking enough of a split, just one little box down here, because the only thing I'm interested in doing is preventing, managing swarming, and I don't want to reduce the colony's ability to make honey. There we go. Here's one of the biggest problems that we have, or the biggest questions that I get about making splits, is the idea of drift. And what drift means, if you've got a hive over here on the left, and it's full of bees, and I'm going to make a split, and I'm going to put it on the, you're going to get what we call drift. And that means all the foragers who leave this colony after you've made the split are going to return to their original home. So you may make a split and think, wow, it's got tons of bees, plenty of bees, and you come back the next day and there's barely any bees left there, and the brood's been chilled. Okay. There's a lot of ways that you can address that issue. One is you can put more bees in there than you think you need. I think a good rule of thumb is if you're being split right next to the original mother colony, put at least twice the number of bees that you think you will need in that split, or leave your split in the location of the original mother colony and move the mother colony next door. Because then you'll be sure all the foragers are going to then leave here and they're going to go to the split. You'll probably have to add a box to it within a day or two. There'll be so many bees, foragers in there, right? So if that makes sense, it's a lot more moving of boxes and bees, but it's going to counteract the negative effects of drift. So that's one thing that's really important is another way to do it is if you make a split. I do this all the time. I know not everybody can because not everybody has bee yards that are 2 miles and 4 miles away. When I make a split at one yard, I end up driving at least 5 miles away to set it up in another yard. Then I don't have to worry about foragers returning to their original location. Hopefully that makes sense too. That is a part, along with the using the queen excluder to make your splits. That is something that will increase the success you have with making splits pretty radically. We're almost there. Oh, I'm just going to miss the 8 o'clock, but we've got some slow. There we go. Okay. All right. And the final, or not the final step, the fifth step is we're going to install the queen, right? So here's our original hive, the splits we've made. The old queen is up in this one because, again, like the questioner said, we want her to still make honey. And so we've got this colony without a queen, and we're just going to put her in there. We want to make sure to put her in, whether we're putting in a swarm cells or a purchased queen. We want to put her in there. We want to make sure she's right there in the brood. It's those nurse bees that are going to get her out and take care of her. If you're doing a forced emergency queen, you want your largest half of your split to make your queen. It takes an enormous amount of resources to make a good quality queen. So if you're splitting out 5 or 8 frames of bees, they're not going to make a good quality queen. You need tens of thousands of bees working to feed all those queens in order to get one good quality queen. Okay. So for purchasing a queen, or for a purchased queen, or for a swarm cell, it's okay to put them in the smaller split. For forcing a emergency queen, that has to happen in the larger split if you want a good quality, big, fat, healthy egg-laying machine. Okay. Finally, check back on both colonies. Make sure that you're coming back. Make sure the old queen, nothing happened to her. Did she get away in all the confusion? Did you smash her? You want to make sure she's still laying eggs. And you definitely want to check on your new queen, no matter how you came about her, right? So here's a little bit of a calendar, really rough calendar on how and when to check. If you've got a purchased queen with a candy cage, we're trying here to go to the next one. I'm going to read some of it ahead of time, but if you've got a purchased queen with a candy cage, you want to check back within a week. That should be enough time for your queen to have been released, usually anywhere from 1 to 3 days she'll get released, and to get fed up and fat enough to start laying eggs. So 1 week. If you've got a capped swarm cell, you're going to want to come back in about 3 weeks to check for eggs. Now, the queen cells are capped long enough. You'll never know whether it's the 2nd day or 3rd day or 10th day that it was capped. They're not capped. Anyway, you could check back as early as 2 weeks, but if the swarm cell you moved over was just capped that day, you're going to have to wait 3 weeks to go back and check on her. Okay. If you're doing a forced emergency queen, it can be as much as a month before that new queen will be laying eggs. Okay. And that directly goes to the math of the free queen. That's a month of no new bees being laid and all of that. So that brings us to the end. I'm going to do a really quick review, try to bring all these up, what we went over. Hopefully there's something in there for everyone to play with a little bit if you're a brand new beekeeper, to think about. And if you've been beekeeping for a while, hopefully there's some good information in there as well. Right? We covered what splits are. Splits, at the end of the day, it's just simulated reproduction. We're just simulating the swarm process. I think we're doing it a little bit better because a swarm doesn't take brood with it. So we're giving them that kickstart of the brood, really gives them a jump start on starting a new colony. We also covered why split, and those reasons were, to increase and replace hives. Swarm management, that really is the number one. Splitting, really, swarm management really kind of dictates a lot of that. And to make sales of nooks. Who to split. We want to assess the colony and the queen, make sure the colony is big enough that it can handle a split, and make sure the queen that you're getting, whatever route you're getting her from, has the genetics and the qualities to take that colony, that split, into the future successfully. Another thing to remember when making splits, the amount of brood and bees, those adult bees, their job is to keep that brood warm. So this time of year especially, you want to make sure you've got enough bees in a split to cover the brood. And we'll see if this one comes up. So, and then we covered how to split. Know your management goal. Why is it you're splitting? Assess your colony that you want to split so that you have, before you pull it open and start moving it into different frames, into different boxes, you know about what you've got. Find and isolate that queen, make the split itself, install that new queen, and then make sure that you check back and you've got good, healthy, egg-laying queens at the head of good, healthy colonies. So just went a little bit over, but obviously we've got till 8:30 for Q&A. So that's the end of my presentation. I really appreciate everybody logging in and coming in here. Again, much appreciation to Jamie Walters and everybody at OSBA for making sure that this kind of education can be provided when it can't be done in person.
Thank you, Dave. We have a lot of questions, so we're gonna run down through here, and we'll, as long as you guys want to stay on, or until Dave gets tired, we'll just keep on going. There's a question that you cannot sell beads without an inspection, and an inspection does not seem to be guaranteed by requesting when registered apiaries. How can I be sure that my apiaries will be inspected? Yes. I'm a Defiance County apiary inspector. Those, reach out to Barb Bletcher and find out. You can go on OSBA's site or go to the Ohio Department of Agriculture, go to the apiary program and find out who your inspector is for your county. Most counties have an inspector. For selling nukes and queens, that deadline is June 1st, and they should have you inspected by then. With the COVID and everything, what's going on, the new protocol, if you look on Ohio State Beekeepers newsletter that went out in April, the new protocol for ODA is that if you had a license last year, they're carrying it forward this year. The only inspections that'll be going on is if you have a new queen license or nuke license that needs to be inspected, then they're going to come out and inspect those people first, and then the repeat sellers after that. How long?
And I'll say that, yeah, getting a hold of Barb or your county inspector really is the best way to go. You know, the vast majority of people working with bees in the counties in the state, they want to make sure that they're doing the best they can. And yeah, thank you for being up to date on what the protocols are for that.
This is from Larry. How long can you bank your queen? Excuse me. How long can you bank your spring ordered mated queens?
Banking, I mean, they lose a little bit of, I don't know how to say it. They don't necessarily lose quality. You can bank queens for quite a while. The longer they're not actively laying eggs, the more they're going to lose weight. And the more they lose weight, the longer it's going to take them to get back up to egg laying performance. Okay. We may be talking about days or hours in difference of performance. So the rule is bank them for as short a time as you possibly can. But I've banked queens for at least 2 weeks. Jamie, if you've got other ideas on that, I've caged queens for up to 10 days and to varying degrees of success. Some hives just really wanted to swarm no matter what. But I'd say 2 weeks at the outside is what I'd feel comfortable doing.
And I totally agree with you that anything over 2 weeks, they start to lose weight because they're not walking around and getting exercise. Yep. They're not being stimulated by the nurse bees cleaning them and helping spread that QMP. So yeah, 2 weeks would be my limit also.
Yeah. And that's a good question because it's going to, you know, if you're going to order queens so that you can do those spring splits, you know, if you order them early, I always look back at my records. What is the weather like? When am I needing to make the splits? And over the years, you can really estimate pretty good. You know, we might have a cold snap here or there that delays you. But for example, I usually graft on my average is about, I think, August 15th to 20th. And just today I put in my first graft. So I'm a little bit behind because we had a cold snap. But again, you can really start to estimate pretty good. Ask at the clubs too. Ask your mentors, like when's the time to split on average?
Carson O'Neill has a question. With queens not being available locally this early in the season, what advice can you give a second-year beekeeper for spring splits without northern good genetic queens?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I would say you're just going to have to really look for those queen cells, monitor your hives, and really approach it as doing, if you're happy with the queens that you've got, find those capped cells and use those for your queens. Just knowing they're going to have to do a mating flight, and you're going to have to keep an eye to make sure that they've returned and they start laying eggs. I mean, I don't know what else to do. I am 100% for local northern queens. I absolutely love it. I also work with beekeepers out in the Pacific Northwest, and they've got some great genetic stock. And I think getting some mixing of stock is a good thing. So I'm not hardcore one way or the other, but I'd say go with what you have, and a lot of times that's a capped swarm cell.
From Jane, what is the minimum number of brood frames for a split?
I'm going to get in trouble here. Do not make a split like this. But I mean, I've made up mating nooks with a frame of brood and a frame of honey, right? And a lot of bees. That's a mating nook. That has not turned into a full hive necessarily, right? I would say if you're going to do a split, the minimum I think you'd want to try is a 5-frame nook, which to me, I'm just automatically going to think 3 frames of brood, 2 frames of food. Does that sound fair? And fill it with bees. Just fill that nook with bees, with the adult bees.
And I've done it with queen castles. You could do 1 frame, but your success rate, if anything happens or it gets chilled or inclement weather to rain of 2-3 days of rain, the more brood you put inside of it with nurse bees, cat brood, the better success. So don't waste your time on trying to get mass amount of numbers of queens. Go with quality. I would much rather have a quality 3 great queens than it is 5 duds.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Like if you're new to making splits, it's just like any other new skill or talent that you're learning. Start off with something that's going to give you the most success. So just split that hive in half. Do a 50-50 split and have a queen that you've ordered, because there's enough balls in the air to be juggling when you're doing splits. So start off with the basic straightforward, get a mated queen, split it in half, give both of those the best chance possible. You do that enough times, then you can get into making the smaller splits.
This question is from Andrew. If you split the queen accidentally into the new hive, won't the old big hive just make a new one, just like a swarm?
Yes. So they should, if they've got eggs and larvae in order to make queens, absolutely. And in fact, if you're not going to buy a queen and you don't have a swarm cell to use, so you want to force an emergency queen, then you want to get that old queen out of the big hive. You want that big hive with its massive resources making the new queen. But they will make it. You will see it very quickly. They will start making queen cells right away. Just know that you now have a lot more risk, and you've got a 30-day calendar before you're probably going to see eggs again in that colony.
Question from iPad W. Bates. Is this all done in the same apiary? Which is a really good question.
Yeah, and the answer for me is yes and no. I alluded to earlier, I'll go set up that system where I put brood above a queen excluder to get nurse bees to go up. And then the next day I come by and I take all those boxes, I load them into my car, and I go off to another apiary, because I don't want that drift problem. Okay. You don't have to do that. You can make the splits right in the same yard. And, this will be up again. Just look at that. Make sure you're adjusting for the drift.
A question from Dave. I recently did a walk-away split to avoid an imminent swarm. That was last Wednesday. How soon should I get into the split without the queen?
This is tricky, because when they are producing a queen, and I guess my first answer would be a question is, did you put swarm cells? You mentioned that it was an imminent swarm. Did you put swarm cells into that? But whether you did or didn't, checking in on a hive with virgin queens can be a very disruptive thing. I do it sometimes, but that just adds a little bit more risk. You're not going to be able to, if you don't see the queen, you're not going to be able to tell if she's there or not until the bees either stop making queen cells or she starts laying eggs. So one thing you could do to check is after about 2 weeks, because it takes 16 days to make a queen, you could steal a frame of eggs and throw it in that hive that doesn't have a queen, that was producing their own queen. And if they start pulling queen cells, you might have a problem. If they don't pull queen cells on that frame, then you've probably got a virgin who just hasn't been mated yet. A frame of eggs is a great diagnostic tool, you know.
Great question. Down here, we have one from Dwight on drift. What about shutting up the split for a couple of days for foragers to reset, make sure they have enough resources?
Yeah, that's something I'll tell you, I personally have never done because, to be honest, I'm a little bit too lazy. It means I have to come back and remember to unplug it. And if you don't remember to unplug it, that can be detrimental. But yeah, you have to make sure that they've got enough food. Obviously, a great way to do that was put a feeder on top of it and plug them up. I believe it takes 3 days. Every 3 days, workers have to reorient to the new hive. So that's a perfectly valid way to do it. My own personal preference is, gosh, if there's pollen and nectar widely available, I don't want to be sloshing around with sugar syrup and stuff like that to make sure they're fed. But you could also, if there was plenty of honey. So yeah, perfectly valid.
The next question is from Shannon. Is it bad business to sell a nuke that has an older queen in it? For instance, if your hive starts raising queen cells and you find an existing queen and put her in a nuke and let the hive raise their own queen, can you sell the nuke with the old queen, or is that being a grumpy landlord?
As long as you're telling the customer, the queen, and they're making an informed decision about whether to buy it or not, I don't think that's a problem. I personally would buy a queen that I know is a year old. I personally sell queens, so I sell overwintered nooks from time to time. So I'm selling a queen that's not quite a year old, but pretty close. But is it bad business? It's bad business if you tell them it's a brand new, fresh queen that you're selling them. It's not bad business if you say, hey, this is my old queen. So I think that's fine.
This one's from Ty. What is the recommended time for making splits? The calendar time. How many days?
Oh, how many days does it take to make a split? I honestly often look at it as a 2 to 3 day process, in that I make my assessments on the one day to find out how much brood and bees and honey I have there. I go back a second day to find and isolate the queens. And then I'll go back a third day to make the splits. But that's when I'm doing, 30 hives in a yard. I'll do that. If you've just got 2 or 3 hives, you could make the split in a day. You could do the assessment, find the queen, and make the split in a day. I think even with just 2 or 3 hives, it's worth doing it over the course of 2 days. I know there's the idea, which is a perfectly valid and very reasonable and good idea, that you don't want to be going into the bees every single day. You want to give them a break for 7 or 10 days. But when you're talking about swarm management, you can get in there 2 days in a row and get that split done, and then give them a break after that.
Here's a $1 million question I hear all the time from Melissa. If you start a strong, healthy hive, is there a general minimum number of brood frames that you should leave in the mother colony to help prevent swarming, but also leave them enough working resources to be ready for the honey production during the nectar flow?
Yes, I'm sure there is an exact number, and it is kept in a secret vault in a place we will never find. No, and I don't want to be glib about that. Every year is different. There's some years that if you left a colony 3 frames, that's too many, and they're going to swarm because the nectar flow is so hard and heavy that they're getting honey bound. And then there's other years you could leave them 15. You could not split the hives, and they're not going to swarm. So, is there a magic number? Yes, and it's an absolutely moving target depending on the circumstances of the year and the nectar flow and all of that. Really, a lot of times in beekeeping, managing this stuff, we're just trying to do the best we can with our knowledge and experience, bringing to it.
Thank you, Annette, for putting in the ODAs. So if you look at it, Annette's comment, it's https://agri.ohio.gov. And then the whole extension out, and then it has the apiary program, and that'll get you the information for who's your inspector in your county. A good question from Rose. I just got new bees and checked on this queen a few days ago. All was fine. Due to the cold temps, I haven't been back in the hive. Is it okay until it warms up?
Generally speaking, yes. Especially if you've got new bees and it gets cold like that, you want to just let them do their thing and maintain their temperature and their heat. And especially in those cold days and cold nights, their number one job is to keep that brood warm and keep it from chilling. And I think it's perfectly fine to let the cold snap ride out and get back to them later on.
Janet has a question. Can I release a virgin queen into a nuke? And probably the process behind that.
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is it's not a first choice you would want to make. I used to do a lot of hand release of virgin queens into nooks, and they would do fine. You've got the mating nook set up, and that's what a nook is, a mating nook, and they can do fine. But you're running a 30% risk of them not returning from their mating flight. But yes, absolutely. When you're taking a swarm cell and putting that in the nook for your split, your little small split, that's exactly what you're doing. You're putting a virgin queen in there. Now, when the virgin queen is an adult, her acceptance is going to be much harder. I often have to keep virgin queens caged for 3, 4, sometimes 5 days before the nooks will accept them. Whereas when you put a queen cell in there, she's accepted before she even emerges as an adult, right? So it's possible. You just have to really watch and make sure. I personally would never put a virgin queen into anything with a candy tube for release. I would always want to do at least a visual check to make sure she's been accepted, and probably do a hand release to really make sure.
Question from Lori. Dave, when is your next talk on finding the queen?
Well, with COVID-19, I actually had a couple of weekends planned for queen weekends where we were going to do finding the queen, requeening, maybe dip a little bit into queen rearing. That all has been put on hold. We may have to find other ways to do some of the finding the queen talks. I am working on a couple of different possibilities, and maybe Jamie and I can talk a little bit too.
Adam's family, how do you have extra queens on hand if they're not tied to a hive as far as banking the queens?
Right. So this is, I guess, more part of advanced beekeeping. There's a couple of ways. So as somebody who raises, breeds, and produces queens, I have cell builders, and I also have what are called queen banks, which are just hives that I put, 10, 15, 30 mated queens that are all in cages into a hive, and let them take care of those banked queens. Another way is, we mentioned it, Jamie brought it up, was the 2.5 hives beekeeping method. Make your split off a little 5-frame nook from one of your swarmy hives to help manage the swarming. Let them, finish off a capped queen cell, and just manage that 5-frame nook. I think Larry Connor even has a book on how to do the 2.5 hives. It's definitely worth looking that up and reading it. And then you've always, for every nook you have, that's a queen that you've got ready to go. It's as good. It's better than a banked queen, to be honest, because she's constantly laying eggs and she is ready to go. And then you can just combine her with your hive that doesn't have a queen with the newspaper method. And you can Google newspaper method, I'm pretty sure.
Rich has a question. What do you think of a 10-frame hive with a divider board to create 2 nukes with opposite entrances? So they're using a division board.
Right. I like them. I've actually got mating nooks that I've got 3-way dividers. So there's a entrance on either side and one on a third side in the middle. They're great. Some of them, I've got mini mating nooks as well that have an entrance on all 4 sides. So all for them.
And I'm going to back that up. I probably have 30 or 35. And I also made division boards down for nukes. And you can stack them right up. You catch a small little swarm, you can put them in and see if they're proven. If they don't, they just crash, and then you can divide them up. But I use them quite a bit in my operation.
And another advantage to those division boards is when you've got that divider board in there and you've got 2 nooks side by side, you've got half the bees but twice the heat. You know, the colonies on either side of that division board can help each other out by helping maintain the colony temperature. So
I have a question from Daniel. How many swarm cells should be put into a split? As a follow-up to that, should you get rid of all your swarm cells in the original hive?
Okay. I'm going to be very careful how I say this. So I'm going to answer the last question first. If you know for sure that your queen is in the original hive and you've seen her and she's laying eggs, go ahead and get rid of all the swarm cells after you've made your split that you're not using. A lot of times, and I came across this weekend, I saw the queen, but this is why I caged the queen. They'd already stopped her from laying eggs. There were not many eggs. You know, she was laying 1,000 eggs a day a week or 2 ago, and I had trouble finding 2 dozen. Okay. So that's a trickier case. But yes, if the queen in the original hive is in good working order and you've seen her and you know, go ahead and get rid of those swarm cells. You can put as many swarm cells into a split as you would like. My personal preference is to find the biggest, fattest, most capped swarm cell and just have that one, maybe a second one if there's another really big fat one as a backup. And I'll tell you why that's my preference. In the natural system of swarming, okay, what happens to all those queens is when that first one emerges, her job is to go kill all of her sisters by stinging them through the queen cell if she can. Most of the time, she can't do that. So there's going to be 2 adult queens fighting to the death. Okay. And I don't want to get into all yes, can 2 queens be in a hive and all that. You know, I'm trying to stick to, you know, your basic scenarios. So this is why I prefer getting a raised mated queen, because that queen she doesn't have battle scars from one of her sisters. She's not going to have a lame leg. She's not going to be, you know, that's why 30% don't return from their mating flights, is they've just gotten in this mano-a-mano fight with their sister, and maybe their wings got tore up a little bit. Maybe they just got damaged in some way that it makes flying for them just hard enough that they can't make it back, or just hard enough that they're slow enough that a bird eats them. So I just like the rule, 1 hive, 1 queen. That way she stays healthiest and most productive.
And in my queen operation, I have about 75 queen castles, and that's what I do. One queen cell per, and then I just go back and check. And then when I know that he's going to emerge on the 16th day, then put on the top and just make notes, or take a Chinese grease pencil and write on the top. So you know the dates to go back and check it. And if she doesn't come back within 4 to 5 days, then you know, put in a frame of brood. If that frame of brood, they start pulling out queen cells, you know that there's no queen or no virgin queen running around, and they'll start that cycle over again.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and Jamie, you couldn't be more right. When you're talking about making splits and waiting for those new queens and you're working with queen cells, taking notes and record keeping is so important, because you've got to know what day to come back and check and when you should expect those eggs. And yeah, a frame of eggs is the best diagnostic tool. If you think you've got a queenless colony, give them a frame of eggs and see what they do. If there's a queen in there, they're not going to pull any queen cells.
And that just about answers Cynthia's question. Wouldn't it be a benefit to get an established and proven queen in a nuke? Absolutely.
Well, yes, Cynthia, and you can give me a call and I can sell you in a step. No. Yeah, I mean, again, making splits is, we want to give that new colony that we're splitting out the best start in life. They're like our kids. We want to give them every advantage possible. So, of course, the ideal is to give them an established, proven queen, or at least a mated queen. If you're getting a mated queen, often, queen producers, we don't sell those queens until we know that they've at least got a good brood pattern and that they're really well mated. So yeah, give them every advantage. Now, during swarm season, we all have to do what I like to call cowboy beekeeping. Sometimes you're out on the range and you see something happening and you just got to MacGyver something together and put that queen, find your best swarm cell and hope that it helps prevent that swarming.
And our last question of the evening from Linda. Where can we get a raised mated queen?
Ooh, you know what? Ohio is a great state because there are so many. Jamie raises queens. I raise queens. I could probably list a dozen people that raise queens. Would OSBA's website be a good resource to look for different queen producers?
Yes. OSBA has a site. I do not have it in front of me, but go to OSBA's website and it has a thing of the local queen rears.
Yep.
Talk to for my side of it, talk to your local clubs.
Yep.
And reach out that way and find out who they've bought in queens from around that local area. If you're trying to outreach from that, maybe that's something we can put in. I'm the editor of the OSBA newsletter. Maybe we can put something together for that and try to get some information out. But local
I can't think of an area. I can't think of a local area in Ohio that doesn't have at least half a dozen to a dozen queen producers. Yep. I mean, we're really lucky in that way. It's so they're out there.
One other from Cynthia. How much does that proven queen cost?
I can tell you what I charge. This year, I'm charging $40 for a queen. And if you remember my math back there, again, remember I'm a biased person because I'm a queen producer. But that $40 for a queen is a lot cheaper than the $200 for the emergency queen, theoretical dollars. But I'd say that you can get queens. I'm seeing the market as being $30 to $45 in that range, maybe some as low as $25.
And for myself, mine, if you buy one, it's $40 because I'll put it in a battery box with support bees and everything else. That kind of a little bit offsets my cost. If you buy 5 or more, that goes down to $35.
Yeah.
And that's what most of them up in Northwest Ohio. So we're up in Williams County, Henry County, all the way over towards Toledo and Lucas. Most of them range around in that $40 range.
Yeah. And let me mention, I think all bee producers I know of, queen producers that I know of, offer some sort of bulk discount after, 5 or 10 or 15 bees, depends on the size of the operation. And it's a great way for clubs to get together and put in a bulk order. I often work with several friends of mine, and we'll put in orders together because we don't want 20 new queens, but we wouldn't mind having 3 or 4 queens from Megan Malbreth or something like that for our programs. Also, I'll speak for myself. I know there are other beekeepers who do this. I appreciate people ordering queens ahead of time. And then if we get to the day where I'm about ready to ship them out and you cancel your order, I personally don't have a problem with that because I've got a wait list of 15 other people that want that same queen. So I encourage people, ask your queen producer what their cancellation policy is. And it's always better to order a queen than to scramble to get one. And again, that varies from producer to producer because everybody's got different business models.
And that's the last question. I do want to thank everybody. So, I mean, everybody, thank Dave for taking his time this evening and giving us some great information. For those that you could not make it, well, we had a couple people chime in that because of the weather or other circumstances that they could not watch the whole thing. Please it'll be published on May 3rd. That's Sunday, May 3rd. We're going to take this presentation and we'll be posting it on Ohio State Beekeepers Association YouTube channel. So if you look at that, remember to subscribe, hit the bell. But thank you everybody for attending. Thank you for all the great comments. I've got multiple comments from everything, Dave. Thank you for the time. Thank you for everything. Great presentation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Very much,
Thank
Dave.
you for inviting me. Thanks for all the great questions. I look forward to reading through some more of them. Really appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Happy beekeeping. Stay safe, guys.